welcome back to my Wargames channel. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Congo Arab state from the 1870s to 1894. In the 1840s, Arab traders from Zanzibar began pushing out and establishing more trading settlements on the Tanganyika Plateau above Lake Nyassa and to the east of Lake Tanganyika. These were permanent settlements, some of which were in areas that were directly controlled by the Sultan of Zanzibar, and others were in his area of influence. If you look at this map, the areas that are tan are those areas that are under control of the Sultan of Zanzibar. The areas in red are going to be areas under his control. These settlements and these trade routes were started primarily for the slave trade and the ivory trade. And these trades went hand in hand. Oftentimes the slaves would be used to transport the ivory to the coast, where both the slaves and ivory would be sold. In around 1870, the first permanent settlements would be established west of Lake Tanganyika, in which was the Congo Free State in their area of control. The man largely responsible for the first real functional permanent settlements west of Lake Tanganyika was Tipu Tib. Tipu Tib was a merchant. He was a slave merchant, ivory merchant. He was the son of a very successful merchant, and he was born in the 1840s. By 1869, Tipu Tib had formed his own caravan, and driven by the need for more slaves, he drove west of Lake Tanganyika. East of Lake Tanganyika, the areas were largely extirpated of slaves. The people that were there were either Arabs or Arab-allied groups, and so there weren't a lot of slaves available. The Arabs had avoided the Congo west of Lake Tanganyika because the tribes there had a very fearsome reputation. They were very warlike, and many of them were cannibals. However, he was not deterred by this. With a lot of money and investments from his financiers, he gathered a number of Arab mercenaries, and they did push into the Congo. The tribes in the Congo didn't have much experience with firearms, and so him with his Arabs, who were well armed with guns, offered their services to chiefs to fight their enemies. And in exchange of fighting their enemies, they would become allies, and they would get loot. They would loot the villages, they would loot the human beings, and take them as slaves back to Zanzibar. And it worked out brilliantly. He was able to find a lot of allies. There's always somebody with enemies, and if you can exploit these very, very warlike regions, you can often come out on top if you're shrewd, and Tipu Tib was very shrewd. By the mid-1870s, Arab settlements like Kasongo and Nyangwe had become very important settlements in the region. Tipu Tib employed a great number of mercenaries among his Congo Arabs, to include Baluchi. The Baluchi had originally come over to East Africa in the Omani Empire as part of that as mercenaries. Some were actual Baluchi, but others were Indians or Arabs who adopted the same style of dress, and they kind of just became known as Baluchi. Others were mixed race, African and Middle Eastern peoples. And so while the term Baluchi is used to describe Baluk people, and oftentimes in East Africa they sometimes weren't. He also had in his employ a large number of Roga Roga. Roga Roga were African irregulars drawn from any number of ethnic groups, oftentimes displaced tribesmen, former slaves, vagabonds, brigands, robbers, anyone you could think of. They were usually young men, well armed with guns, and that's what made them so effective. They hired themselves out as mercenaries. They were sometimes slave traders, slave catchers, and they're generally employed as fighters. They didn't really do other work other than that. Occasionally, they would work as bodyguards. And in this illustration, you can see that this warrior actually has a rope on him for tying up slaves. In addition to the Roga Roga, a number of tribal allies were employed. These ones are Watuta. You don't typically really see them in the Congo, but you do see them east of Lake Tanganyika and north of Lake Nyassa being employed, fighting alongside Roga Roga, alongside Arabs, and sometimes against them. The other man in this sketch, dressed in Arab clothing, would be a good example of a Congo Arab. Congo Arabs were not often or always Arabs. They sometimes were. Sidney Langford Hind describes in his book, The Fall of the Congo Arabs, white Arabs, and what he means by that are ethnic Arabs. But an Arab in this context of Congo Arab could be a black African, it could be an ethnic Arab from Arabia, it could be a mixed race person. Sometimes it would refer to Baluchis, people who weren't even Arabs. What it really meant by that was people that were Muslims who spoke Arabic or Swahili and adopted Arab dress and customs. Tipu Tib himself was a man of mixed race blood, and as is common with Arabs, you do sometimes see them differentiated, but they're often just called Congo Arabs very generically, and that can include a number of people. Sometimes they're misidentified. Your average European and Belgium, it may not exactly know the difference between a Balouk or an Arab. The Congo Free State claimed the territory all the way to the western shore of Lake Tanganyika. They before the mid 1880s, they were not in any real position to claim the land. They couldn't control it. In 1886, they did build a settlement, a station at Stanley Falls, and there they would come into conflict with Tibu Tib. The situation was resolved, however, in 1890. Tipu Tib did retire back to Zanzibar. He left his nephew Sefu and his one of his most prominent warlords, Mohara, in charge, and tensions continued to simmer until 1892 when full-scale war broke out. At the outset of the war, the Free State controlled the Upper Congo. The Congo Arabs controlled the area south of Stanley Falls, a fortress as far north as Amati, an area west as far west as Mapono. At the heart of the Congo Arab state was Nyangwe, Kasango, and the Romaliza fort. The personnel that were available would have been Congo Arabs, both Omani Arabs and the Baluchi, who were often just kind of counted in with the Arabs, as well as large numbers of natives. At the outset of the war, Gongo Lotete, who fought for the Congo Free State, was actually allied with the Congo Arab state, and they had tens of thousands of native warriors. In addition to those native warriors, would also speculate, and I think it's very likely that they would have had some Ruga Ruga, just some African irregular mercenaries they hired to fight with them. That would only make sense. The tactics employed by the Congo Arabs were usually defensive in nature. They could fight offensively, but they were not trained and they were not sophisticated enough to do anything more than a simple skirmish line when they were out in the open. But defensively, they were pretty good. They built fortifications, wooden palisades called bomas, and outside the palisade would be a trench. Often inside, there would be covered firing areas. There would be additional bomas within the boma that would be partitioned off, and so if a defender breached the outside wall, they'd often find themselves in a crossfire. Now, in pretty much every fight that the Free State forces find themselves in, they're assaulting at a defended, hardened position. They're assaulting one of these bomas, and it's very costly. And at the Rumaliza fort, it is incredibly costly, and they do spend quite a amount of time doing that, and they have to bring up 2 Krupp guns to finally take it. The armament of the Arabs widely, by and large, consisted of percussion, muzzle-loading, smoothbore muskets, though I'm sure some were rifle muskets. They did have in their possession large numbers, though, of Winchester lever-action rifles and carbines. Large numbers being relative, we're talking about if you have 2,000 arms, maybe 20 of those will be Winchesters, but still more than what the Free State forces had. Here you can see a really excellent sketch of a Free State assault on one of these bomas. The area around them was often clear cut. They had an excellent field of fire, and the Free State troops would come under heavy fire when they assaulted the bomas. So discipline was tantamount. They had to have it or they would have never succeeded. The tactics they had developed them early on when they were pushing out of Zanzibar in their slave raids, fighting groups like the Nguni or the Maasai, who knew that the majority of their arms were, especially in the early days, muzzleloaders. These groups would often wait until they fired their first shot. They'd go to ground, let them fire their first shot, and then they'd fall upon them before they could reload. And so, in that sense, they did learn a lot. They preferred to fight from defensive positions because then, after you fired your first shot, you still had time to reload while the enemy tried to scale a 12 to 15-foot wall. And that really worked out well for them and a lot of their expansion into the Congo. That tactic really only falls apart in the 1890s when they face a real disciplined force that can bring up Krupp guns. That really changes the entire dynamic. Before that, it had worked pretty well. With the end of this war brings the end of the Congo Arab state. The Free State is able to now finally assert its control over their claimed territory all the way to the western bank of Lake Tanganyika. The Arab slave traders, many of them are able to retreat across Lake Tanganyika, but their days are numbered. The British are finally getting their act together in Central Africa and they're forming units to combat slavery. Their territory in the Congo is now firmly under Free State control, and pretty soon the Sultan of Zanzibar will be pressured to outlaw slavery and outlaw the slave trade. Now we can talk about miniatures and how we're going to rate our units. There are great miniatures available from Wargames Foundry. They have an entire Darkest Africa line that includes Zanzibaris, Balukis, Ruga Ruga, and tribal infantry. You can also find a number of good models from North Star Miniatures and Cobblestone. And let's discuss our Congo Arabs. They're really going to come in two flavors as far as rating these men for the men who would be kings. First is going to be irregular infantry. I would rate almost all of these men as irregular infantry, unenthusiastic. They tended to break and run when it got tough, unless they were well within like a good boma like the Rumaliza fort. Now, in the standard book entry, everyone is armed with an obsolete rifle. That's perfect. If I were going to do a unit armed with Winchesters, I would upgrade them to sharpshooters. I would not upgrade the rifle to be not an obsolete rifle because the Winchester lever actions they carried were still in 44 caliber, either 44 Henry or 44 Winchester centerfire, so they weren't really long range, but they did have an increased rate of fire, which increases your volume of fire and should increase your hit probability. For the artillery, I'm going to rate them as a poorly drilled field gun. Next, we have our Baluki. They're going to be a lot of fun. I would use irregular infantry for any Baluki armed with muskets. But even at this date, they tended to stick to their matchlock muskets, and so I would downgrade them to an antiquated musket. I would also make them poor shots. However, I would make them veterans. The Baluki were by all accounts pretty tough. Onto Baluki armed with swords, I would use the entry for tribal infantry, and they were great swordsmen, and so I'd make them fierce. I'd add that rating to them. Otherwise, just tribal infantry. For the Ruga Ruga, I would just use the entry for regular infantry. I wouldn't give them any modifiers one way or the other. The real reason to use Ruga Ruga in an army is they're interesting, they look cool, and you can have some fun painting them up. That's about it for the Ruga Ruga. For the tribal infantry, that's going to be a bit tricky. You're obviously going to use the tribal infantry entry in the rulebook, but the rating could really change a lot depending on which tribal group you're using. Some had reputations of being much more fierce than others. The good thing about tribal infantry, there are a multitude of miniatures available from different manufacturers, and so you can represent even some of the tribes from the Tanganyika Plateau that would have come in as mercenaries to help out. I don't feel there's a great deal more I can say about this, but I did want to add the second part video, the Congo Arab state, as the balance to the Congo Free State. As far as the tribes, I could always add more about specific tribes and how they fought, but I would like to do that in other videos where I could do a video that maybe does a short overview of three tribes and any differences they had and how they fought. And so I may do that. I may also discuss maybe some of the peculiarities of the Congo Arab state slave raiding armies to the ones further east, the armies that were really operating out of Zanzibar. And I guess that's all to say, so thank you for watching, and goodbye.